it going? This is Hellbent, and welcome to AutoHotkey short tutorial number 11. In this one, we're going to be looking at how to use the checkbox, and let's just jump into it. So basically, I have everything that I need to get going. We have a template of a GUI that's 500 by 500 with the name GUI, and then if I close, I can close out of the script. So let's go ahead and add in our control. Now this is my second time recording this. The first time it was about 11.5 minutes. Hopefully I can get it down to under 10 minutes with this time. Check box. Okay, so here we have our basic control. I'm just going to position it up in the top left corner with an X10 and a Y10 for its position. We don't need to worry about its width or its height unless we plan on, just like with our text box, unless we plan on changing the text that's associated with it. We don't actually need to allocate any width or height. It'll do that on its own. It knows how to do that, so we don't have to worry about that. And then we're just going to add in some text, and we're going to call this the checkbox. And I think I have everything I need to give a quick demo of that. Okay, so here we have our checkbox. Now, a checkbox has three basic states. We're only going to be discussing the two main ones in this one. In my main tutorial for the AutoHotkey GUI series for the checkbox, I cover way more than we're going to be covering in this one. So we're only going to be covering the two main states, and that is where our checkbox is not checked, and then where it is checked. So how this works is we're going to associate a variable with this control, and that variable is going to get stored with a value through the submit function or the submit command, where if we have it checked, it gets stored with a value of 1, and if it's not checked, it gets stored with a value of 0. And then we can use those 1s and 0s to actually do some scripting through conditionals. But if we were to just run it right away, and the first thing we'll do is we'll create a variable, and I'm just going to keep this short, I'm just going to call this check1. Now with naming your variables and things like that, you don't want it to be generic names like this. You want it to be something that makes sense for what your purpose with it is, because once you get into larger scripts, you're going to have a hard time knowing which control is which based on its variable name if you use generic names like this. Okay, so we have a variable, and what we're going to do is I'm going to first show you that even though we've added a variable to it, and the next thing we're going to do is actually I'm going to set our checkbox to be in the checked state to begin with. So when I run, here, let me run it first. When I run it, it'll start in the checked state, and I said that when it's in the check state, it stores a value of 1. But what we have to do is actually go ahead and submit that into it. In other words, it's not going to reflect that. So to prove that, what we'll do is we'll put up a message box right here. So as soon as it loads the GUI, it'll also load this message box. And this message box is going to display the value of check1, which is our variable. So even though it's in a check state, because we haven't actually submitted it, it doesn't have a value yet. So when we display our message box, nothing is going to show up in it. And there we go. So we can see that even though we said that the checkbox is checked, we said that if it's checked, it gets a value of 1. But because we haven't submitted it, it hasn't actually impacted the variable. So what we're going to do is, before our GUI actually is finished before it's actually finished loading, what we're going to do is we're going to make sure that any controls on our GUI, any variables that they have associated with them, we're going to make sure that they get updated with their basic value. So if it's unchecked, it'll have a 0. If it is checked, it'll have a 1. And likewise with any radio buttons or anything else that we have, we're going to make sure that anything that they're supposed to have, they have as soon as the GUI is built. So before our return, we're going to add in our GUI submit command. And now when it runs this message box, we should see a reflection of this checked state for that variable. And there we go. Now we're getting our 1 for that checkbox. Okay, I also mentioned when I did the always on top mini tutorial that I'm going to show you how to use the checkbox to actually control whether the GUI is always on top or not. So the first thing you need to do is you need to decide what state do you want always on top to be when you first run the program. When I use it, I usually like to have always on top to be the default, so that's why I have this checked. So I'm going to make sure the checkbox is checked, and then inside of here I'm going to use my GUI always on top. So that way it starts with the always on top turned on. Okay, we're going to go ahead and run it. And now I can see if I click over here, it stays on top. We're done with our message box, so we can get rid of this. And the next thing we're going to do is we're going to actually create a label call. So we're going to execute a G label, and then it's going to have the contents of that is going to decide how our always on top works. So in here I'm going to make a call to a label, and we're going to call our label always on top. Original name, right? Okay, now what we need to do is we need to create the label down here. Always on top. And we'll add in the return right away. Okay, so there we have our label. Now we need to decide what it's going to do. Now, because we're going to be changing the value, we're going to be checking on our checkbox inside of our G label. As soon as it executes, we want it to once again use this submit command. So right away, as soon as it comes into the label, we're going to submit any value that has changed with this checkbox. So we're going to type in our GUI submit and no hide. So there we go. It'll reflect any current changes that we've made to our GUI. And now we need to actually make it so that way if it's checked, and here let me change this name so it reflects more of what we want it to do. So we're going to change the text that's displayed beside it to reflect what we were doing with it. Okay, so let's have a look. So we run the script. It starts with the always on top check, so we can click on this page and our GUI stays up on the surface. Now what we're going to do is we're going to make it so that way if we uncheck it, when we click on this page, it gets buried underneath our stack. So the first thing we're going to do in here is we're going to check the state. We're going to check for those two states. We're going to check if it's checked, and we're going to check if it's not checked. So we're going to say if, and I don't need to put this in parentheses, but it's force of habit that I like to have my conditionals inside of parentheses. It goes back to when I worked with C programming, so that's why I'm using the parentheses. I don't need the parentheses. I could do it right without it, but it's habit. Okay, so we're going to check to see if our variable check1, if check1 equals 1, we're going to have GUI plus always on top. Else if check1 equals 0, or if it's in its non-check state, we're going to do the reverse. We're going to have GUI minus always on top. And there we go. So we're going to go ahead and run this and check to make sure that it works. So here we go. We start with an always on top state checked, and if we click on this page, the GUI stays on top. If we uncheck it and then go and click on this page, this should get buried down to the bottom. And there we go. If we pull it back up and turn it back on, it stays on top again. Alright, that's it for this one. Be sure to hit that like button to keep these tutorials coming, and I will see you on the next one. Once again, if you have any questions, you can always leave a comment down below. And if you're not comfortable asking questions in a public forum, you can always send me a private message and I'll get to you when I can. The way you go ahead about sending private messages is you go to my home page. There'll be a tab called About. You click on that, and at the top of the next page there'll be something that says send message or something like that. Just click on that, and then when you're waiting for my reply, to see my reply, what you need to do is you need to find your messages and then look at your sent messages. It won't be in your received messages, it'll be in your sent messages, any reply that I give you. Alright, and I will see you on the next one. Have a good day. Peace out.